Alright, so the next story from Nightmares and Dream States we're going to talk about is Chattery Teeth, which is, number one, once again, an odd one to decide to adapt to screen, because this would be the type of concept that's relatively hard to pull off without looking totally stupid. And, of course, leave it to a TV movie to try that. But the interesting thing about this TV movie is that it's the adaptation of a couple of stories. Because we've got Chattery Teeth as the first half of it, and then The Body Politic, which is a short story by Clive Barker, as the other half. And it's got the whole sort of stories that go around it, but it's not necessarily in the way you would think. It's a very interesting and sort of unique setup in regards to I don't know if anthology movie is what you would call it, but because usually there is the wraparound story of there's the beginning, and then in between the story, and then to end it. But they kind of do that. There's a different wraparound story for each story, and they both involve the character of Quicksilver, who is Christopher Lloyd. Christopher Lloyd kind of looking like it's like he's still in his Uncle Fester makeup, but remember when they put like a wig on Uncle Fester and tried to make him look normal? He kind of looks like he's back in that sort of territory. And the first part involving Chattery Teeth, he comes across a bride whose groom their car is broken down on the side of the road and the groom has gone off. And so he tells the story of Chattery Teeth to this bride for some reason. Because it's what he does, I guess. And then the weird thing is that this is actually wrapped up in line with, like the Chattering Teeth kind of come out into the wraparound of this story, and then before they go into the body politic, it's like a brand new one, where it's Matt Frewer at, like, a fair, and he's a pickpocket, and then Christopher Lloyd's character is there, and then they go into that, with Chattery Teeth never really coming back into it. It's basically like they're two entirely separate entities, with the same recurring character, and they kind of do the thing where the actors in the wraparound story are in the story itself. In this case, the groom and the bride are the characters in Chattery Teeth, or the groom is the main character, and then the actress playing the bride is also his wife, who is more or less off screen outside of a picture. So it's an interesting setup that you don't normally see with these kind of movies. But the trouble is if they pulled off the adaptation of Chattery Teeth off or not, because that's all we're going to talk about here. We won't talk about the body politic or that second half of the movie or anything, just this portion featuring Chattery Teeth. And the interesting thing about, like I said, this being an interesting choice to adapt to the screen because of how hard that could be to pull off in an effective way, is it definitely works as a story. 'Cause even in story form, like even coming from King, he really ran the risk of this being a too dumb to accept concept. So the interesting thing, though, is the setup in regards to him with this hitchhiker and deciding to give him a ride after they've been at this gas station. Because what's interesting is it takes so long to get to the point that the Chattery Teeth even come into it, is that it gets you so wrapped up in this hitchhiker story that you kind of forget that the teeth are even a part of it. Because it kind of turns into that classic hitchhiker story that you see in stuff like the Twilight Zone episode or the Hitcher movies or whatever. And it just kind of becomes one of those, with the teeth being like the final payoff to them. And it's like it kind of, if you're going into the story blind, it's one of those cases of you start to wonder what exactly the story is going to be, because while it is something as silly as the teeth come to life and chew people to death, when you look at it from like a blind perspective, it could be like when you get far enough into the hitchhiker portion of the story, your question could be, is this what the story is? Like, is the hitchhiker the main threat? And maybe because he buys the Chattery Teeth at the beginning before this happens, maybe the Chattery Teeth are just a symbolic thing or something. Maybe they won't actually come into play in that very supernatural way. And then there's also, but with that in mind, it's like there's nothing to suggest that's going to be what happens. And so when you think about that, where it could just be a classic hitchhiker story, and it'll have whatever payoff it's going to have, it's almost surprising, even though it's fully what you would expect at the start. Going into a Stephen King story about Chattery, that's immediately what you would expect. But the fact that it's the final payoff kind of does it in a kind of a new way, where it's not exactly... It bides its time just enough that it's kind of unexpected when the expected happens, if that makes sense. And then you throw in the fact that there's a storm involved in this, a sandstorm that's like making all this even more chaotic than it already is. There's so much going into play that it seems as otherworldly as it is that a pair of live Chattery teeth eventually come into this at the very last minute. And some of the ways he describes it in the story, something that you can't exactly capture on film, would be stuff like, I mean, we see it in the adaptation because it's very, for a story that you would expect them to take liberties on, it's a pretty direct word for word adaptation from the page to the screen. But some of the ways he describes things that we've talked about in other stories, here, when it's in like the brown paper bag and the teeth start to move, and the way the bag is moving, because it's got like a tear in it, he describes it as, it's moving like an amputated lung that refused to die. And it's like just something like that, that kind of description that only King would visualize, is in itself, before we even see the teeth walk out, it just gives it this really unsettling vibe in itself. And does make it feel like really otherworldly in the way, like even more so than what they actually are. Just gives you that really uneasy vibe that this is just something totally unimaginable that's about to happen. And a couple of things that the adaptation adds in is the hitchhiker's more or less like a random occurrence as far as I remember, as far as the story goes. But they do kind of set it up in the adaptation where he's driving down the road, and because of the storm, he almost hits the guy. And then this is supposedly the guy getting him back at him for that. Or he's the kind of guy that would always do this. It doesn't really matter. The point is, he's a crazy hitchhiker, and he's in the car, and our main character could potentially die at any moment. But there's also something in the description, as far as I remember, of the story, which is, in the story, there's something a bit more unsuspecting about the hitchhiker. So, like, he's described as a kid, and he doesn't seem all that threatening. He keeps talking about his eyes, but that's about it. And it's only, the eyes only seem more threatening the more the story goes on. But with the dude in the movie, it's pretty much, he's totally suspicious right from the start. He looks like a serial killer. So, and the thing about this is you kind of have to go, like, when we're inside his head, and it's not a first-person story, but we get enough description about why he makes the decision he does, or why he hesitates, because we get the whole story about a hitchhiker he picked up in the past that robbed him and, like, you know, slapped him with his own wallet and stuff like that. And how he really, like, considered and weighed the options in regards to whether or not to pick this hitchhiker up. And he does seem very straightforward, but whereas we see Hogan, the main character, is like a guy that's kind of been driven to this point by his previous experiences. The thing is in the story, I kind of got the vibe that Hogan was like just sort of a seen-it-all kind of guy, where he got wisdom from his life experience, and he was curt in some places because of it. This Hogan, while looking like anything but that, does not look like a guy that's had like these really hardened experiences in his life before, which very well could be the point. But he comes off less like the wise type, and more like the experiences in his life have made him secretly unhinged. Because he seems like a totally normal, like, almost businessman type or something, like a very boring kind of dude. And like I said, I can see where the appeal to this is, but the fact that he just feels like an insane person after about maybe 5 minutes in the car with this hitchhiker, it feels like a pretty big jump, a pretty drastic jump, that seems a bit off, but yes, but then of course, eventually, we get into the teeth attacking by the end of it. and by the end of this story. And this is another one of those cases where we talk about it being, I don't mean to be, derogatory towards TV movies, but obviously they're on a bit more of a slimmer budget than, say, like a full-on, like, theatrical release movie or whatever. So when the teeth attack, in the story, they, like, bite his nose completely off, and they bite his balls completely off, and it's, like, really graphic and really gruesome and all that stuff, and it's something that like, I'm not somebody that thinks everything has to be absolutely gruesome in order to get the full effect, but at the same time, the concept is so ridiculous that the balance of the ridiculous with the really gruesome and jarring is what makes it work, is where they find that balance. So here you've got something in the movie adaptation where we're actually watching it happen on a screen. It looks really stupid when it's, like, biting at him. And then it doesn't help at all that the gore is not present at all. Like, it kind of bites on his nose, but then it lets go, and there's no real visible damage whatsoever. And we don't even get the ball biting. It just starts to bite all over him until it cuts. And then he's dragging him through the desert. And that's the thing, is it looks so dopey looking, because talking about the story was, the whole thing is that the teeth are the final payoff, one of the final payoffs. There's, like, the epilogue and everything, but as far as the build up with the whole Hitchhiker story, the big payoff is what the teeth do. So when it's adapted in this way and looks that dopey, is the payoff worth it in the way that it's worth it in the story? And I don't really think so, but I do like that they kept that shot that can really be ingrained in your memory when reading the story of the teeth dragging the hitchhiker away. The only trouble is it works much better as a distant shot, which it starts off as, but then when we actually get the close-up where it's the teeth pulling him by his hair, it doesn't look that great. So, that's the thing, is, would take the gore out of it, it's pretty much an absolutely 100% direct adaptation, like, all the way down to the words. And so the question is will a direct adaptation, like an adaptation that faithful, always work, or will there be times where you have to make changes for the sake and integrity of the story itself? Because sometimes some things will just work in text, or maybe you're in the confines of a budget and you can't go as far as the story might require, and then the story will suffer for it. Was there a point? Well, the thing about that is that another thing is, with a story this ridiculous, is when you're reading, even if, like, because you'll notice when you read a story or a book and then you see a movie or TV adaptation, the really, and there'll be cases where, especially if it's a famous book series, there is massive, massive, massive hype around a movie adaptation of people wanting to see what they read on the screen. And that's a lot, I feel like a lot of that has to do with the fact that you're still going to get somewhat of a new experience, even if it's characters and a story and moments that you already know from a book. There's something about seeing those little differences from what was in your head versus what's actually on the screen, and if one betters the other or whatever, or how close your interpretation of it was, because sometimes it can be really satisfying if it's exactly as you pictured it, or you can see that story in just a slightly different way as far as, like, aesthetic or whatever it may be. And so that's the case, is even if you have an author that's as descriptive as King, you can still, even with all of the details that you get, where there is almost nothing left for the imagination, because he gives you every single possible detail, your imagination can still take liberties, and does probably without you even realizing it, and sort of adding a whole sort of visual thing, because no matter how descriptive a story gets, I feel like there's no possible way, like, any one vision of a story that somebody has in their head while reading is going to be exactly what another person sees. So I don't think it necessarily has to always be an adaptation this direct. And sometimes that can almost maybe hurt it, that they don't take just a little more liberties for themselves, and maybe try to enhance it for the screen just a little bit. But this, I don't know, because that's the thing is, while the story is so psychotic and terrifying and exciting, none of that is in the adaptation, despite it being directly taken from page to screen. It's kind of a weird concept, but that's how it manages to turn out somehow. Um, but then we do get an interesting little like epilogue in regards to the Quicksilver Highway, where we go back to the Christopher Lloyd scene, and she's saying like, okay, why did you even tell me this story? It's like, is there a moral? Is there a point? What is it? And the thing that I think I really love about Chattery Teeth is the fact that, when talking about King, we've talked about the fact that a lot of his movies have, like, or a lot of his stories have, like, sort of double meanings. Like, you can take something that's, like, seems strictly horror-related, but when he adds his human element to it, you can see how they kind of work together to tell the same story. Something really human and dramatic, and something that's just full-on horror, and possibly even ridiculous. And sometimes you don't need a moral, or you don't need a point. Sometimes you're just telling a scary story, and that's what this feels like. It just feels like a campfire story. And I love when King just kind of... I mean, the reason King is that he's able to make those... to put those human elements into his stories, and that's what makes them have such an emotional power, and makes them even more scary than they already are. Because he establishes a real enough world, and then he puts the over-the-top horror into it, making it feel real. And then there's other cases where it's just this. It's just a campfire story. And you can sense that he's having, like, a lot of fun by doing that. The fact that you don't have to put too much of your emotional self into it, especially if you read a lot of the King that does, it can almost seem like a nice sort of emotional break to just get a story like this that's just a flat-out, freaky story by itself. That's not really trying to say necessarily anything or anything like that. It just sort of is what it is, and it works based just on that itself. So, yeah, so once again, the story works much better than the adaptation, but like I said, this is a story that was going to be hard to adapt anyway, and maybe they thought it was the safer call to just adapt it directly, because what else? Because it also kind of takes away, it almost it almost strips them of their own responsibility, because it's like, if they directly, totally, and completely adapt it, if it doesn't work, then they can say, what did we do wrong? We took exactly what was on the page. But just something about it doesn't work, even though it's the same just about everything. But yeah, it's definitely a story that works much better on the page, as based on the concept alone you can probably suspect. So we'll probably leave this at this. We've got one more story in Nightmares and Dreamscapes that we're going to touch on, and it's the last one we have to touch on the miniseries. And then one more in Night Shift, which by process of elimination you probably know if you've looked into that, and then Skeleton Crew has the last one we'll talk about. So I think, so we're almost to the end of this, and like I said, reviews will probably be coming back, at least for as long as they can, and the verses will be continuing with my brother and all that other stuff, and all the other shit. So until all that other shit, that's it for this.